Hello, I am Merryana Salem, aka Mary. I am a Lebanese-Aboriginal bisexual woman.
Hi, I'm Durr-e Adan Haque, also known as Daya. I'm an Indonesian-Pakistani non-binary lesbian.
We are two writers who love movies, television, and books, especially when they're gay.
And welcome to GayV Club, where we'll be analysing LGBT texts
that we like, that we don't like, and how we relate to these texts as gay people of colour. Finger guns.
What's up?
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to yet another episode of GayV Club.
Thank you for listening. If you like GayV Club, please like, subscribe, rate, leave a nice review wherever you listen to podcasts. We're on Twitter and Instagram at GayV_club if you want to follow us for updates or give us any feedback or suggestions.
Yeah.
And we also have a Patreon if you want to support us, which is patreon.com/GayVclub, where we've got quite a few bonus episodes up now.
To our patrons, we love you.
Thank you.
All right. So what are we talking about today, Dee?
We are talking about two different shows today. We're going to do a little comparison, a comparative study between two different texts, and they are The Bisexual by Desiree Akhavan and Fleabag by Phoebe Waller-Bridge.
Which you probably haven't heard of.
Yeah, I don't know if you heard of Fleabag. It's really niche and underground and they only got 2 seasons, bro.
Yeah. Yeah,
cancelled after 2 seasons.
The Bisexual is a 2018 limited series written by, directed by, and starring Miss Desiree Akhavan as Leela, an Iranian-American woman in London who takes a break from a decade-long relationship with her lesbian partner to explore her bisexuality. Meanwhile, Fleabag is a 2016 series written by and starring Phoebe Waller-Bridge as Fleabag, a millennial Londoner trying to cope with the recent death of her best friend. The second and final season aired last year in 2019 to a very average amount of critical acclaim. Honestly, I swear, maybe
completely flew under the radar.
Nobody knew of Fleabag. Nobody cared. Yeah, look, it was niche.
12 Emmys is nothing. What is that? Please.
I mean,
show me something actually impressive.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, it didn't do what Schitt's Creek did. It didn't win everything in the comedy category. So, honestly, who really cares?
But yeah, so we wanted to discuss these two shows in comparison with each other because they have many commonalities and they deal with similar issues of sexuality, femininity, loneliness, and heartbreak. It's actually very easy to describe these two shows in a way that makes them sound the same. If I told you there was this really great show exploring the sexuality and emotional turmoil of a woman in her 30s living in London, you'd probably guess I was talking about Fleabag because, joke's over. No one watched The Bisexual.
Unfortunately, yeah, nobody watched The Bisexual.
It is available on Hulu and Stan. Since friggin' episode 2 of this podcast, we've been telling people to watch The Bisexual, but hopefully now that we're talking more in depth about it, and hopefully now that we're oh, this is like Fleabag, you might be a bit more interested. Truly galaxy-brained people might assume from that description I just gave that I was talking about Michaela Coel's recent masterpiece, I May Destroy You, and we will definitely discuss Miss Coel more in depth later in this episode.
Oh, yes, we will. I got you, Miss Coel. I love you.
So we've already discussed that this show has a similar premise, so I guess we'll just move on to our first point, which is the staple of this podcast, which is the bisexual representation in both of these shows. Mary, take it away. Mary, our resident bisexual, our token bisexual, our bisexual
me.
Expert.
Yep, the expert, me, who has been single for at least a year now. But whatever, here I am. Bisexual rep, let's take it away with Fleabag first. So there is some small moments prior to the big moment, which is in season 2, episode 3, which everyone is probably going to think of when we say bisexual representation in Fleabag. But before I get to that moment, I do want to point out that, if you are a person who is not straight watching Fleabag, you probably would have picked up there are quite a few little tiny blink and you'll miss it moments. I don't think they're as blink and you miss it as something like Birds of Prey. They're ambiguous enough that they can be denied if people wanted. I mean, in the very first episode, she asks a woman to come for a drink with her. There's also when she offers that woman who's drunk to come home with her. What else is there?
There's your OTP.
My OTP, oh, that's right. So in episode 3, we have literally what I believe the direction of Fleabag should have gone in, but, didn't. Very iconic scene. It's very funny, actually, when she goes into the sex shop with her...
With the bus rodent.
With the bus rodent, with the train rodent. She's entered the sex shop with him and is buying a funny present for Claire, and while she's browsing, the sex shop employee flirts with her, and Fleabag looks over her shoulder back at us and is like, oh, hello. It's really a short moment, but I do, and I will talk about this later, but I do think that Fleabag should have ended with Fleabag and the sex shop employee being in love. Because I can't think of... No, I'm not going to expand on that point because I'll talk about it later.
Okay.
I feel like those were the main sort of moments that I can think of in Series 1. Was there anything after that? Everything is overshadowed by that moment for me in Series 1. I can't think of anything else.
Personally, I think there's a lot of gay subtext with her and Boo, her best friend.
Oh, yes. Sorry, how could I forget Boo? Yeah, I don't know. There is just so much love between her and Boo that it's very easy to read into that as gay, and I don't blame anyone for doing that. Like, it is very... Their friendship is very intense, and it's very clear that since Boo has died, Fleabag has lost a lot of light and happiness in her life. The flashbacks between her and Boo are just so warm and loving that it's very difficult to not read. It's very difficult to not read into it. But yeah, there's lots of beautiful scenes with her and Boo.
Boo and her mother were like the people that she loved the most in the world.
And she's lost both of them.
I understand if people don't want to read into Fleabag and Boo romantically because obviously horrible circumstances. But I think it's there anyway.
Yes, and obviously also we see Fleabag with men.
Yes, primarily with men.
I mean, literally the opening scene of Fleabag is her with men, so I don't know, I don't feel like I need to go into detail with that. But the big moment, and this was the moment that people wrote friggin' articles about, was this sort of casual confirmation of Fleabag's bisexuality, which occurs in season 2, episode 3, when she is rejected by Kristen Scott Thomas in a bar. Dee's fantasy.
Yeah, I was very surprised by that episode, fulfilling my very specific fantasy of vibing with Kristen Scott Thomas and then being rejected by her. Yeah, thank you, Miss Waller-Bridge, for that. But yeah, they have a nice conversation and they kiss, and then literally the next scene is her just going to knock on Hot Priest's door.
If you want to read into Fleabag as a whole meditation on being a bisexual disaster, I think you do have the right to do so, because there's enough there. But one thing I will talk about that I guess I'll talk about in the next section as well is something that annoys me, is that Fleabag's bisexuality, it sort of goes unnamed, first of all. Like, she doesn't say bisexual at any point, which you could make an argument is in character of her to say. But something to notice is she doesn't talk about being into women. She doesn't talk about that with anyone, and all the scenes where that sort of happens, they very much happen in a vacuum. She doesn't talk about them even with us, so I feel like it's just another vehicle for Fleabag to show how lonely she is, even in relationships, which is fine, but yeah.
No, I mean, I think back, I think Fleabag as a show could have been gayer. Everyone thinks that. But I don't know how much that would be good to do. Because, we primarily see her pursuing men and the way that she treats them, or at least thinks of them. And I don't know if it would have been the same with women. Clearly, there were really good vibes with Kristen Scott Thomas, but we don't know about the rest. Even though, we use the scene where she's taking a drunk woman home as evidence of subtext, like, that's not... That's not really good behavior to invite an extremely drunk woman home with you who can't even recognize that you're a woman.
Yes, no.
That's a little bit problematic.
Yeah.
Also, something we can take into consideration here is how in the original play of Fleabag, there is that line where she's talking about a girl who she texts even though she's dating Harry, and she says that girls don't count. Which isn't fun.
No, because that's like implying infidelity, but also at the same time invalidating
women's same-sex attraction, basically.
Yeah, like, I remember when we saw that at the movies and I just thought to myself, there's so much to unpack in that one line.
The way we both cringed.
Yeah.
Also, another thing is Phoebe Waller-Bridge's history of bisexual characters outside of Fleabag.
First up, there's Crashing. She actually wrote Crashing at the same time she wrote Fleabag. So it's actually quite an interesting little show to watch if you get the chance.
I actually prefer Crashing to Fleabag Season 1.
Yeah.
Rewatching Fleabag, I realize I actually don't care much for Season 1 anymore.
It's just because Season 2 is so good, but yeah, I get that. First of all, I want to address, there is another weird line that comes from Phoebe's character, this Phoebe derivative character.
She's like bootleg Fleabag.
Yeah, she's like bootleg Fleabag, and she's playing a ukulele, and she's singing about how, even though she doesn't think she's gay, she watches lesbian porn and gets turned on. I guess that line might not mean anything, but when you consider it in the larger context of what we see in Fleabag, it's just interesting. But in Crashing, there is a whole plot line that revolves around a man realizing he is bisexual.
Yeah, so Sam is this white dude who falls in love with Fred, who is pretty much openly gay, but he kind of spends the whole season denying his attraction, and actually being quite aggressive and violent with Fred, which is very upsetting to see.
And one can't help but wonder if that would have played out differently had Fred not been brown. Because Fred is...
He's definitely of South Asian descent. Side note, I love Fred so much. But yeah, the relationship between Sam and Fred, even though it ends up being quite sweet, is very tumultuous. It's very violent. There is something to be said about how a lot of mainstream TV narratives about gay men or just same-sex attracted men discovering their sexualities are very often violent, where they express their denial quite aggressively, often taking it out on their gay love interest, who is very often less masculine than they are. I'm not saying that this kind of thing doesn't sometimes happen in real life, because of course homophobia and toxic masculinity go hand in hand, but it sucks that on TV we're seeing this all the time. The most recent example I can think of is Lovecraft Country. It also happens in that one episode of Rami that I watched because Desiree Akhavan directed it. Side note, I'm pretty sure Rami Youssef only got her to do as a way of validating his homophobic script. But yeah, Crashing doesn't get nearly as violent as those last two examples, but is still not great to contribute to that trope.
No.
And then, of course, we have Killing Eve.
Oh, you're in... yeah, I suppose we should.
The main character of Killing Eve is Villanelle, who is a bisexual sociopath. We've already discussed this in our bisexual representation episode, so I don't feel the need to elaborate so much. But let's also consider the fact that, like Fred in Crashing, Eve is also a person of colour.
People who think that Villanelle and Eve are gonna be endgame or whatever, need I remind you that in the 4th episode of this show, they killed a character right after they came out as bi, which was Bill, my mate Bill. He literally has this beautiful scene where he talks about how he loves men and he loves women, and then literally the very next scene he gets violently murdered by Villanelle.
It is worth noting here that Phoebe Waller-Bridge only worked on the first season of Killing Eve, which honestly I really liked at the time, because back then Villanelle resembled a lot of my favourite existing ships. But I think what actually came after in seasons 2 and 3 is exponentially more homophobic, lesbophobic, and biphobic. But yeah, that's just a little seed that Phoebe planted. So as much as I'm happy that we got these tiny crumbs of queer rep in Fleabag, I don't know how much I care for it. I wouldn't want an entire meal of it. So moving on to The Bisexual, the show is of course called The Bisexual. There are interviews with Desiree Akhavan where she talks about the way that she's been tokenized throughout her whole career, and the way that, whenever she's introduced at an event, they always mention the fact that bisexual Desiree Akhavan, bisexual Iranian director Desiree Akhavan, or, bisexual Lena Dunham Desiree Akhavan. So yeah, she kind of just owned that moniker and called her show The Bisexual. Which is great. So that follows a woman who has basically lived as a lesbian for the whole 30-something years of her life, and is just getting out of a 10-year relationship with another woman named Sadie, who's about a decade older than her. The catalyst for this is that Sadie proposes to her, and Leela feels unsure about it because she hasn't really known herself outside of being with Sadie, so that causes them to take a break in pretty much the very first scene. But yeah, I think one of the strengths of the bisexual, maybe one of the reasons why it's unpopular, but one of the reasons that I really love the bisexual is it's very much made for LGBT audiences.
Amen.
In the way that the premise, like the way of bisexuality is not like a woman who's, been in straight relationships all her life, venturing out into the mysterious LGBT community and their world and like creating that spectacle. It's actually turning heteronormative relationships into the spectacle, which is what I find really quite humorous and quite clever about the show. It's made for us. It's like the familiar world of the LGBT community, and then she's branching out more into the heteronormative world and like how different that is.
It does the old switcheroo. In this show, she occupies this really strange space where for a while she doesn't feel like she's accepted by either. And yeah, it's just, it's so good. Could more people please watch this? I know we beg people every episode, but here is your reminder again.
So in the bisexual, her character's name is Layla. Layla's sexual escapades with men are a spectacle. They're very open and often quite humorous. They're even like disastrous. I get like so much secondhand embarrassment from some of them.
Yeah.
Especially the first one, which is just incredible. So Fleabag also uses sex as a spectacle. There's no nudity in Fleabag. However, it's pretty much out in the open and it's shot in this really awkward, it's somehow full frontal without having nudity.
It's
in that way, it's not like so much embarrassing. Because the way that the scenes are presented is Fleabag is very much in control of what she shows you here. And you actually get to see her internal monologue, which very often has nothing to do with sex at all. She actually doesn't seem to like sex that much, despite always pursuing it, because her mind is always elsewhere. Her mind, she talks to us instead of actually engaging with people, except for when she doesn't. But it's just another function of to emphasize her loneliness.
Yes.
In this sense. In the bisexual, this also happens again, like, I think in like episode 3 where she's with this really nice guy, John Chris. Even though she's finally like getting her groove and actually in a nice relationship other than her previous failed attempts with men, there's a point where she realizes how, even though she doesn't feel like there's any difference in the act itself, just her needs are not being met, basically. She actually ends up being bored by it.
Doesn't she also talk about how she realizes, like, she's never had any autonomy in sex? Like,
yeah. So while it's still good with John Chris, there's a lot of nice emotional intimacy for a bit. There's a scene where they're having sex and he's like, "Where are you? You're somewhere else." And he's like, "What are you thinking about?" And she's just like, "I'm thinking about, like, if I can still return my coat to Zara, which I only wore once." And he asks about when she was with Sadie, like how that went, and she does that since they got together when they were really young, so Layla was in her 20s, in her 30s. Layla didn't feel comfortable expressing any concerns or like any desires in relation to intimacy with Sadie, so she kind of just let things go along. Which I think is a really nice thing to have acknowledged. Because as we've mentioned before, and as people are probably aware, age gaps as big as the ones between Layla and Sadie are quite common in our community, unfortunately, for many reasons. So it's really nice that actually, like, a lot of Desiree's work actually explores that dynamic and kind of the damage that that sort of dynamic can cause to a person.
Yeah.
Like, it's something that I really related to, something that I know a lot of my friends could relate to, where she talks about how she just wasn't able to really speak up and, like, have any kind of autonomy or control in that relationship, which is one of the reasons why she ended it, because she wanted to know who she was outside of being with Sadie. So I like that Fleabag and the bisexual are quite honest about sex in very different ways.
And also, like, quite honest about it from these women's point of view. I don't know, something that I find frustrating, and I guess because I do spend a lot of time on Tumblr where this is, like, the dominant culture, which is that, like, all LGBTQ rep is worth celebrating, which I don't agree with. I think there's a lot of bad LGBT rep out there, and I don't think half of it is even worth celebrating. But I really liked how in the bisexual, it had the guts, I guess because it was speaking from a place of honesty, to say, like, this aspect of the community, like, this thing that happens because of these age gaps.
Like, it's an actual critique.
Yeah, like, it causes a loss of autonomy that isn't cute. Like, that isn't good.
that isn't wholesome.
It's not romantic. It's not good that this happens. And, you know, the fact that it took Layla until she was 30-something to...
until they were broken up to actually talk to Sadie about this stuff as well. Because, you know, they're still work partners. Like, they still run a business together.
Yeah.
So that's a fun dynamic throughout. Well, not fun. That's a very entertaining dynamic throughout the show to watch. But yeah, they don't actually talk about this until they're broken up. And Sadie is, once she finds out that Leela is dating men, she feels quite angry about it at first because she doesn't quite understand it. She kind of assumes that Leela has been straight the whole time, which is, of course, unfortunately a very common misconception made against bisexual people. But she does eventually grow to understand it, especially after Leela starts seeing another one of their female friends and realizing that it's not so much about meeting her needs in terms of sexuality, but about her just emotional needs.
It's actually really nice watching her go through that. Like, watching her, like, have that growth is very nice.
Both shows also deal with family drama. Leela, she's cut off from her parents because she's been living with a woman for about 10 years. But she does have a logical family with Dennis, who's another Middle Eastern lesbian woman who is her friend.
Even though Leela's biological family don't make an appearance in the show, we do get some insight into how she feels about her family and what her family dynamic was like. Mostly in a line that speaks to me in a lot of ways, where she says one of the reasons she never explored her bisexuality, like, before now, like, there's lots of reasons, but one of them is if she had known that she could do something other than love women, then she wouldn't have put her family through what they had to go through when she came out. She wouldn't have put them through that. It is quite a sad thing to say, and something that I'm sure a lot of people can relate to.
Yeah, I definitely related to it. I've mentioned before on this podcast that I used to identify as bisexual from basically when I was like 17 to 20 years old, because I was. And I remember during that stage, there was a lot of self-hatred involved, where I would kind of just pray that I would fall in love with a man so I would never have to go through the ordeal of what being gay in this world is, and also so I would never have to go through the ordeal of being out to my family or having that sort of relationship with my family. So, like, the way that she talks about, like, I wish I had that option, I feel like a lot of gay and bisexual people kind of have that regret and shame about themselves.
Something that I also like, this idea that, you know, coming out is not a thing that you do one time. It's something that is constant. Even when you believe you've been established in your identity for a while, it's still something you have to do. The scene I relate to a lot is when she sort of informs Gabe that she's gay, basically. And, like, even though the way she does it is quite funny, you can also tell that she's quite apprehensive. That moment has to keep happening throughout your life. Because it does. Like, in reality, it does. Like, I don't get these movies that are sort of like, oh, thank goodness, this person has come out and now they are finished. It's done.
No. I've been at my current job for like a year. I don't know if people know. Another thing that the bisexual explores, there's like on one end of the spectrum is Layla and on the other end of the spectrum is Dennis. Dennis is closeted and she's scared to really come out of the closet because she doesn't want to lose her family. I like that the bisexual also has that empathy for closeted people that don't want to come out. I feel like a lot of media is like, oh, you have to be out and proud, otherwise, you know, it's really, you know, disrespectful to the people that are. But like there are several reasons why people will choose to stay in the closet, especially if you're a person of color. If you want to keep your relationship with your family, like it's a really hard decision.
Or if you're from a religious background. So both of these shows deal with community in some way. Like I feel like both of these shows deal with either like the absence of community or like
a social circle, a support circle.
I think Fleabag is more of a show about loneliness than anything else. I do wish people would talk about that more. I feel like a lot of people talk about a lot of aspects of Fleabag, but the thing I see the least is people talking about how that show is about grief and how it's about loneliness, which I think is the two main things it's about, essentially, because Fleabag is an incredibly lonely character, and she presents it very funny, but it's quite confronting in the sense that, you know, she doesn't really have any friends. friends. She is close to her sister, but not in a way that she can depend on that. Even in relation to her sexuality, she doesn't even get a sense of community from that. So it's all very lonely for Miss Fleabag. I do think the bisexual is also very much about community, but the difference is being how you can still feel lonely even when you're in a community and part of a community, either, you know, just because of interpersonal struggles or personal struggles. I feel very strongly about the fact that both of these shows end with their protagonists being alone, but I think the key difference is that when they finish, they're not lonely anymore, or rather they're like comfortable with the loneliness.
In a way that you know they're going to be all right now.
Yeah, they're going to be okay. And I am actually very much obsessed with the way both these shows end, because I like LGBT media that doesn't end with a relationship fixing everything. Or really, actually, I like any media like that. Not even LGBT media, like just any media. Because I really don't subscribe to the idea that even a friendship can fix everything.
That romance is the happy ending.
Yeah, but even like, I don't think there's any single relationship, friendship, family, I don't think there's anything strong enough to fix a person. Like, I think that takes yourself, you know, and a whole lot of other factors.
I mean, relationships definitely help.
Oh, yeah.
And it's
I'm not
important
saying
to have them, especially friendships, but...
Yeah, I agree. Like, all of these things help. Like, family, friendships, romances can help, but I don't like them being presented as the thing that is the be-all and end-all.
That is the solution.
So I really like that about both these shows, finding a sort of comfort in your own loneliness because you found autonomy in it, and I feel like that's what Fleabag and the bisexual speak to, which I really like.
The bisexual does explore the kind of isolation that she feels like in the first few episodes, where she does go exploring relationships with men and she feels like a little bit alienated from her existing friends in the community, but she finds that she doesn't have to like leave this community, like it's very much still her community.
Yeah.
Like she doesn't belong in the heteronormative world anymore.
No.
Like she never belonged there, and it's really nice to show that she still has that there for her.
Another cool thing that the bisexual looks at is the generational gaps between people in the LGBT community and how that affects your view on sex and sexuality. Like, you have Leela in her 30s, Sadie in her 40s, and Francesca in her 20s, who is the girlfriend of her roommate and friend Gabe. So she shows that generational gap with the way that Sadie grew up in an intensely homophobic society where she had to remain closeted and had to cover herself from suspicion in some of the most horrible ways.
Yeah.
And the way that Leela had to fight for that too, despite growing up in a slightly more liberal society. Like, the plotline about Sadie's anger towards and later acceptance of Lila's bisexuality is not a narrative that you could have written with younger characters. Like, it's very easy to just hate Sadie for not being able to understand the very straightforward concept of bisexuality immediately. But the show is very sympathetic towards both of them in that journey, I think. There's also quite an interesting scene where Lila is talking to Francesca about how the internet has really opened things up for younger LGBT people. Like, not to say that there's no struggle involved, but like the way that we have been able to find community, at least over the internet, and be a lot less lonely, and also have access to resources that are mostly safe and age appropriate to help us understand who we are and help us and support us, as opposed to older people in our community who, at least when they were our age, had nothing close to that.
Yeah, and I do appreciate the way that Leela says it sort of scares her, because it's something that she can't imagine, because when she grew up, she didn't have that.
Like, it's something that she's glad for.
Yeah, but also doesn't really understand. Like, can't really imagine.
I can kind of understand that fear, because even though I just said that our generation has had access to age-appropriate resources, this has only really happened in, like, the last 5 or so years. And as someone who's, like, right in the middle, on the border between millennial and Gen Z, I did not have access to those resources at the age when I really needed them. So while I'm glad they exist now, I cannot relate my personal struggles to those of people who are, like, under 20, usually. Like, you kids genuinely baffle me, but I'm happy for you.
That scene where Leela is talking to Francesca was something I could really relate to. My older sister is also gay, and even, like, the differences between her and I.
Oh, wait, how much older is Mads?
Mads is... Hang on, Hang on, I gotta count. Give me a second.
Okay, well, let me just say in the meantime, Mary's older sister Mads is so cool. She's the bass player in a band called
Sleepeaser.
Yes.
If you're into like noughties sort of pop punk grunge, then you'll probably dig their sound. I actually really love their new song Secrets. It's really cool. And they're releasing a music video soon too, so
Cool.
yeah. Sidetrack of promoting my older sister's band and stuff.
Have you figured out how much older she is than you?
Yes, I have. She's 6 years older than me. Mads is 32. I am 26. And even though 6 years is not like a massive gap in the scheme of life, the universe and everything, her experiences growing up as someone who was gay were very different to mine for a lot of reasons. We even went to the same school, so even like comparing my experiences at school with her experiences at school, very different. That scene even where Leela says, you know, everybody under 25 thinks they're queer. It's nice that Miss Desiree can acknowledge that from the other side. Do you know what I mean?
Mm.
Like, I feel like you don't have to be a quote-unquote like young person to sort of write about the differences.
To understand these things.
To understand these
to
things.
notice these differences.
And also to be respectful of them, which I think the bisexual is very respectful of Francesca's whole sort of vibe. I would like to talk about the next thing. I want to speak more to the general similarity between these two shows.
This is where we actually get comparative.
Yeah, this is where we actually get comparative. Woohoo. So both the bisexual and Fleabag fall into this genre, part of this larger genre known as the precarious girl, or the precarious woman. And the precarious woman genre tended to be centered around women whose coming of age occurred during very destabilizing times in the noughties. So looking at women who came of age during like the GFC, global financial crisis and such. So generally millennials. And because of coming of age in this time of destabilization and economic uncertainty, the women in these stories tend to exist very precariously. Also, because of the proliferation of the internet, these women, I said these women as if I am not one of these women, but like women in these stories are dealing with the sort of deconstruction of information, the decontextualization of information, and destabilization of lots of concepts of race and gender and all this stuff.
Feminism.
Yeah, feminism.
Can you give some other examples, please?
I can, because actually I realized when by the way, this episode is sort of half based on a paper I did for an assignment last year in my final year of my degree, where I compared both these shows. So this part of the episode is where I'm taking my notes from that and talking about it. And I realized when I was reading up stuff that this genre is actually like my favorite genre. So some recent examples of shows that fit into this is I May Destroy You, another Michaela Coel show, Chewing Gum. You've also got shows like Selfie, New Girl.
Girls. HBO.
Girls is like the big one that a lot of people associate with the term precarious girl. Like when you look at academic papers written about precarious girl, 9 times out of 10 they're talking about girls. There's also Search Party, The Bold Type, Broad City is another big quote-unquote staple of this. Insecure is another big one. Insecure is pretty big actually because it was the short sort of web series that Issa Rae made before Insecure, which was called The Diary of an Awkward Black Girl or something. Like that was really like the first time someone had made precarious girl content that was about a black woman, so it was pretty big. So another commonality in these shows, and I think something that sort of characterizes them, is the idea of the legacy, quote unquote, or weight of second wave feminism and the pressure for women to have it all versus these women being from a generation who are financially and socially unable to do that. So second wave feminism sort of taught women, you know, you can have a career and you can have a baby and you can have a house and you can have all this stuff. But the women in these shows, and I guess millennial women in general, are having to reckon with the fact that, okay, so supposedly we can have all this stuff, but financially and socially, like, that's just not really possible for us in so many ways. I don't want to talk about that for too long because otherwise I get really sad.
Yeah, that's okay. We're already sad.
Yeah, we're already sad. But that's where the comedy and drama of this genre comes from. It comes from that confliction of, okay, well...
That's where the hashtag relatability
it comes from, like, you know, we are adults and should have all of this, but we can't.
But we don't. We are failing at adulting and at womanhood.
Yeah.
I think this is exemplified the most in Fleabag with the idea of her being like a bad feminist. So Fleabag is she's one of those modern women. She's been educated on the patriarchy. She's like aware of gender inequality, and she like experiences misogyny. More importantly, she recognizes when she's experiencing misogyny, and like the show actually points that out. And she calls herself a feminist because to say otherwise in this day and age is considered strange. Because to be aware of women's oppression and to not, say you oppose it is considered strange and is sometimes frowned upon. So many women, mostly white women, they almost like confuse this dislike of the way they are treated with feminist ideology. But obviously, feminism is much more than that. It should be more about what you do than just what you believe. But yeah, so Fleabag, she's just kind of one of those women who superficially calls herself a feminist because she doesn't really engage in any sort of feminist action. She only cares about gender inequality when it directly impacts her. And this is what people like Angela Davis have referred to as bourgeois feminism or white feminism. So, like, back to the Precarious Girl thing. I think, like, the first time I watched Fleabag, like, one of the most relatable things is I took the whole bad feminist thing as just, like, another one of the show's jokes. Because, obviously there's no such thing as bad feminists. You either, do the work or you don't. And Fleabag never does anything like remotely feminist. No. She's kind of just a white woman living a selfish existence and just saying things out loud for an audience. In the first episode, she says, I have a horrible feeling that I'm a greedy, perverted, selfish, apathetic, morally bankrupt woman who can't even call herself a feminist. And I thought that one of the main points the show was trying to make was that it doesn't matter if she's a feminist or not. It shouldn't matter that you can't call yourself that because you should be allowed to kind of just focus on yourself and exist. Because something that I took from watching Fleabag is like personally reassuring because like Fleabag, like while there are definitely feminist ideals that I care about and believe in quite strongly, like I don't engage nearly enough with like feminist action and like actual activism to call myself that because like Fleabag, I don't have my shit together. So I kind of always thought of Fleabag as being one of those reassurances of like, being a precarious girl is like you can't, especially given like the social and financial issues that we all face in this particular time period and within this trope, is that, it should be like it's very difficult to actually take that time to be a feminist. But it's quite strange that the critical and general audience and reception that comes from white women especially, that people actually took Fleabag as a reassurance that like despite their own similarly, selfish is a harsh word, but similar existences that they could still call themselves feminists regardless. But yeah, so that's something about Fleabag that makes me uneasy and probably one of the reasons why I don't really like season 1 anymore.
Yeah.
Because like, this is not what I thought of the show, but the way people talk about it is just quite strange. Even the way Vicky Jones, she's a producer on Fleabag and Phoebe Waller-Bridge's best friend, she was doing an interview about her show Run, which Phoebe Waller-Bridge is also in. Yeah, and she was talking about, like, what Fleabag did for feminism, and I'm like,
what did Fleabag do for feminism?
What did Fleabag do for feminism? Like, it did a lot for, like, I don't know, women's voices in the popular media, which is good, but I don't know what it did about,
Speaking of Vicky Jones, because I'm actually, like, my thesis, I'm literally talking about white feminism and what shows that are purporting to be feminists but actually are just, like, white feminists, what they all have in common. And part of that was me looking at criticisms of Fleabag and what did these criticisms have in common. I found this quote from Vicky Jones where I don't know if we can ever speak fully to the intention of artists and their artworks unless they've explicitly said this is what I intended to do. But like, there's this quote where she says, "We're all a part of this feminist culture, so we wanted to write a character who's a product of the world that we see now, as opposed to a leading light of feminism." And I just think this quote, and maybe because I've been analysing so many of these types of critiques, it just speaks to this problem that I see with a lot of these quote-unquote feminist shows, where the women who write these shows are making the assumption that their experiences as a white
are universal.
woman. Yeah, as a white woman who is middle or upper class, like, that is universal. And so every woman will be able to relate to this because every woman must have experienced what I've experienced. And no, I don't think that. And I wish that they wouldn't try and promote their shows in this way because that is immediately a red flag for me. And it is one of the many reasons, like,
it also, like, alienates women of
that's
color
what I was gonna,
or
yeah.
people of color and, like, LGBT people.
Literally, that's one of the reasons why I didn't want to watch Fleabag when I first heard about it, was because I looked at it and, you know, me being a fan of the Precarious Girl genre, I just thought, I don't see what's actually different about this show than any other show.
I remember the thing I said that made you start the show. I was like, it's like BoJack Horseman, but she's not a horseman.
Yeah, and I was like, oh, okay, because everyone knows I love my horseman.
Yeah.
Not like in a furry way, I just like the character. Like, please don't think I'm a furry. I'm not a furry, I'm really not. But, like, it actually took quite a bit of convincing to get me to watch Fleabag because I just looked at it and thought, I don't see what is different or special about a white woman running around who is so reasonably relatively well off that she has the energy to just be looking inward all the time and being like, oh, am I a feminist? Am I this? Am I that? This is something that I want to talk about with the bisexual. Like, the bisexual obviously draws on the precarious trope, especially in that Leela is also dealing with the expectations of female sexuality. But I feel like Fleabag more deals with the expectations of her gender specifically, which is fine. Leela's intersections of marginalization, like the fact that she's a woman of color, the fact that she's bisexual, also make the bisexual like a very rare occurrence in the precarious girl genre. Like, it's very sad, but it's true. Like, there is still not enough in this genre about women of color. The precarious girl genre is still very white, very cis, very straight. I think you made this point once that people like Leela, people like us, we don't really have a choice about being feminist or not. Like, it's sort of automatically assumed because we're already so, like, marginalized. Like, you kind of have to be. You kind of have to support yourself.
Yeah. Like, even if you're, like, not able to do any actual feminist action or activism, but just believing that you have basic human rights. It's just, you know, labeling yes. For the record, I don't want to say that I don't support it. I do.
Oh, yeah, no.
I just don't feel like I'm enough.
No, I get you.
You know, believing that you should have basic human rights does make people think you're... Like, I watched a really good documentary called Above the Curve. It's about the lesbian in the 90s who started Curve magazine, also known as De Neuve magazine, which was, like, the only lesbian magazine at the time. And she said that, like, when you've been invisible for so long, your basic visibility is seen as radical. I remember when we were, like, starting this podcast and I just said, oh yeah, we're just talking about, like, LGBT film and TV. One of my friends, she's just like, oh yeah, you're really, like, supportive of, like, that kind of, like, activism and, like, really believe in that. So I'm like, GayV Club is not activism. I'm just being a nerd with my friend.
Yeah.
Like, it's so weird that just talking about things that aren't talked about is perceived as activism, is what I'm trying to say.
It is very strange. Like, I've had a couple of people message me, and I do, like, I take it as a compliment that they do. I don't see it as a bad thing, but, like, people message me saying, oh, you're one of my favorite activists. And I am absolutely, like, in no way an activist. I try to keep up with activism in the sense that, you know, when movements are happening, I try to support them and I try to keep up with what's going on. But I am absolutely in no way, like, a community organizer. I'm very much a supporter of activism, but I am not an activist. And I think this is a separate conversation we could have, but I really do think the term activist is applied way too willy-nilly to people because of the internet. I appreciate, actually, Zendaya even has said, like, people call her an activist, and she's like, do not call me an activist. I'm not an activist, I'm just an actor. Like, and I'm like, yes, that's true.
It kind of trivializes the work of, like, actual activists
it really does.
who are doing so much good. But yeah, I think the bisexual does touch on this, even in, like, the very first moment where they're being interviewed about their business, which, for the record, is, like, really cool. I just have to say, like, the whole thing is that they're creating this app where, like, you take a photo of a piece of clothing and it tells you where you can buy it.
I feel like that's an idea for an app that so many people came up with, have been thinking about for like at least the past 10 years.
Oh, yes.
Like everyone has wanted that, but I like that in this fictional world of the bisexual, like that's a reality. I just think it's really freaking
Honestly,
cool.
and the irony of that app existing in the bisexual, but only existing in the bisexual when all I want is that app so I can find out where Desiree got that green coat from. Like, please, sis, where
it's
is
from Uniqlo. Or at least like the cheapest, nicest version of it will be at Uniqlo.
I know.
But yeah, so even in like the very first scene, they're being interviewed by this guy about their business, and he's kind of talking about like, what's it like being a woman in business, all that kind of stuff. Fleabag does touch on this in a separate way, like actually in the Kristen Scott Thomas scene, but Sadie's is like, I think that's a really stupid question, like can I not answer that? Even in the scene later where they're at a lesbian club and Gabe, who is a straight man, just randomly blurts out like, so what do you guys think about blue as the warmest color? Do you think it's a fair representation of lesbian women and their partners? And they all kind of just stare at him. It's like, why would you expect, especially like when you're having fun, like in a bar, like to have like such a deeply intellectual conversation about this kind of thing? Or even like when they reference the L word in this show and like and like they have to disclose like, I do not think that the L word is good, but I gotta say I like that the bisexual kind of looks at the way that the assumed radicalness of just being visible in the world.
Leela's precariousness, like, isn't just the precariousness of being a millennial. It's also literally the precariousness of being brown and being LGBT. A key difference, I think, between Fleabag and Leela, I actually didn't talk about this in my original essay because I didn't have the time, but like a key difference, Leela is only now taking the time to be sort of messy and objectionable. Because it's only now that she feels that she can do that. Whereas we get the sense that Fleabag has been like this for a long time because white women have the space to be objectionable. Because I feel like for white women, they really want to dismantle this idea of fragility that's been placed upon them, or rather they've placed upon themselves. I will say they placed it upon themselves because it was a key thing in racism, and won't go into that now, but this idea of fragility that white women have associated with them, their sort of last thing of feminism, their like tenet of white feminism is like shaking that image, which is all fine and good for them because they have the space to do that because there's already this perception that they are perfect and fragile and all this business. But like women of color, we are already so heavily judged just for existing, just for like being in a brown body, and if you're gay as well, it's like, oh, how dare you, that we are not given the space to be objectionable. And I think the bisexual is very much Leela giving herself the space to do that. And it's very rare that we get to see that.
Which leads us to a big question that we wanted to discuss in the episode, which is who gets to be relatable? Who gets to be the precarious girl who is chosen by TV and film producers to tell their stories in a way that is marketed and presented as relatable to their audiences? There is a really good essay in Another Gaze called The Making of a Millennial Woman. It's written by Rebecca Liu. She basically does take a look at the precarious girl trope. She looks at girls, she looks at normal people, she looks at cat person, and kind of just the way that white women are afforded this opportunity to be messy on screen and objectionable and #relatable, having freaking nervous breakdowns in the way that people of color and women of color often aren't afforded, like at all. So I think it's time for Merryana's Michaela Coel rant.
Yes! Alright, so I just think it's quite interesting.
I just think it's funny how. I just think it's really interesting.
Really funny. I just think it's really interesting that Miss Michaela Coel wrote a little show. A lot of people haven't heard of Chewing Gum, despite the fact that it won a BAFTA. It's called Chewing Gum. Stop me if you've heard this one before. It's about a woman who is a millennial.
Living in London. Exploring her sexuality and emotional turmoil.
Have you heard that one before? I love Fleabag, but you know, Chewing Gum was a show that dealt with a lot of the same themes and plot beats, i.e. older British millennial woman addresses the camera and us as she stumbles her way through her confusing relationship with sex and feminism and family around the same time, 2015 to 17. Chewing Gum even had identical roots, right? Identical roots as a piece of one-woman theatre written and produced by the leading woman, Michaela Coel, who then adapted it for TV. Has identical types of scenes wherein Tracy, who is the protagonist of Chewing Gum, addresses the camera while on the toilet, bored or panicked during sex. Also centers on a older sister dynamic where the older sister must leave a bad relationship, and even has the exact same episode structure and episode amount. I could go on, but you get the idea. I'm not accusing Phoebe Waller-Bridge of stealing from Michaela Coel, but But I do think it's quite obvious which messy millennial women stories people believe are quote-unquote new and fresh and worthy of acclaim. And it certainly isn't stories centering on visibly unapologetic working-class black women like Michaela Coel. Chewing Gum also has a bit of a dark cloud over it for me now that I know what I May Destroy You is based on. But yeah, look, I still want to acknowledge this question of who gets to be relatable. I think if you want the answer to that question, you merely can look at the kind of reception that Fleabag got for being this type of show and the kind of reception that Chewing Gum got. And I'm not going to say that Chewing Gum didn't get any critical acclaim. It did. Like I said, it won a BAFTA. But it certainly didn't reach the level of saturation, to the point where, I'm kind of sick of hearing about Fleabag, which is why Adi and I were making those jokes at the start. And also, Phoebe Waller-Bridge is now getting greenlit for all these shows. People want to work with her, all this stuff. Where are those opportunities for Michaela Coel? She only just now got another show to run, which was I May Destroy You, which is excellent. We'll probably need a whole other episode to talk about I May Destroy You at some point because it is so good. But yeah, I do think this question of who gets to be relatable, it's not that hard to answer. It's very clearly, even though we can talk about how...
Who has been allowed
to be relatable
in popular media.
Because I find Tracy in Chewing Gum a lot more relatable than Fleabag. In terms of who she is and what she does. I remember actually thinking while watching Fleabag, I was like, how can she afford all this stuff? Because her cafe is failing and all this stuff, but she seems to be very well off. And
yeah, emotionally I can relate to her, but
circumstantially, no. I think one of the weird things that people like to tell me when I bring this up is, Chewing Gum was made for teens or something. First of all, I don't think that Chewing Gum was made for teens, at all, when you actually watch it. Yeah. I think it's actually quite adult.
I don't know, British TV is weird where, a lot of the quite adult content is still quite popular. Younger people, Skins, for instance, Misfits. I was watching that shit when I was 13.
That's true. No, I feel that. It's hard for me to judge that as well. I do feel because Michaela Coel, because Chewing Gum was about a black woman who was working class and not posh in any way, I don't think Chewing Gum and I don't think Tracy as a character was ever elevated to the level of quote-unquote relatability that Fleabag has been elevated to. The reason Michaela Coel's writing is not elevated to that level is because she's a black woman. And it's sad, but it's true. But I'm always standing, constantly.
It is picking up for her, so I'm very excited to see what she can do, even though COVID has made... popular media a hellscape.
Oh my god.
For the next few years, I don't know. But yeah, it's so cool that she's getting the recognition that she deserves with I May Destroy You.
She better sweep the Emmys next year, man.
She better. And yeah, I guess, similarly to this, because Desiree Akhavan is an Iranian woman and is openly bisexual, is also kind of a reason that her work is not elevated. But the critical reception has been a lot to do with the kind of woman that's at the forefront of these shows. But also, something that I wanted to talk about is I feel in recent media, especially over the last decade, mainstream audiences, they've developed this kind of misguided desire for straightforward platitudes, straightforward messages about what the piece of media is about, what it's trying to say.
I do agree with that.
So there's been this sort of laziness in audience interpretation, and I don't mean this condescendingly because I believe this comes from the internet and the way that the internet feeds off viral content and the way that a lot of these studios nowadays will promote their shows on the internet with the express aim of going viral. And the way that they do that is by sharing clips or screenshots of these moments of dialogue or monologue that are just really profound, really correct, like words that make people go, wow, this sounds like so amazing. I wonder what the rest of the show is like.
Yeah.
And like Netflix are hands down the masters of this technique. Like how many times have you seen that Enola Holmes quote shared around in the last month, like that, you have no interest in changing a world that suits you. And it's actually like the only good line in an otherwise extremely shallow movie. But people are sharing the clips because they agree with that line and pressing play because they're expecting more. So, you know, not to say that I think Fleabag is as calculating about this as Netflix originals tend to be, and also Fleabag still leaves quite a lot for interpretation, but Fleabag is full of those beautifully written moments, and the semi-monologue format really lends to that. That's another reason why I think that Fleabag has had so much success, because it's full of all these quotes that are more shareable, more gifable. Like, I cannot count how many times I've seen my own gifs of Fleabag being like reposted all over Twitter because people love those snippets, and I really love those snippets because they're excellent. But on the other side of this are shows like The Bisexual, which doesn't really have moments like that. It has maybe like 2 or 3, but otherwise it leaves most of it for you to interpret privately. It's more like an indie film, which makes sense because Desiree Akhavan is an indie filmmaker. It doesn't offer any specific answers to any of it. You can argue that Fleabag is like this too, but as we've been saying this entire episode, Fleabag's audience has already decided quite definitively what to take away from it. By the way, this theory is not really my own. Shout out to my friend Ash, who I saw talking about how this has happened in books over the last decade, like this increase in like definitive codas and straightforward morals of the story, and like how authors are kind of forced to do this now in order to be popular.
I never thought about that, but actually now
Yeah, but like back to The Bisexual, I have mentioned this on the podcast before, but a criticism I've read that has always stuck with me is the characters don't always say the right thing, which kind of again leads to those expectations of, you know, being an activist and being a feminist and being radical that's placed on LGBT people of color. But in a sense, it is true, but that's because she's leaving that room for us. And I believe what makes this show so good is that the conversations sound like real conversations that LGBT people have with each other privately about our experiences. Like, none of us know what the right thing to say is. And like outside of like academic or artistic contexts, we barely have the vocabulary to convey these things. So I think the most profound moments in The Bisexual are the silences, because the performances are so good. You can see everyone, you can see all the characters trying to process these things at the same time that we, the audience, are, which I do love, but it's a lot less straightforward, but it's not something that many people will have the patience for because the internet has specifically encouraged our impatience.
As we always say, though, I think, you know, the phrase is like the devil is in the detail, but for us, I feel like that's where the good stuff is, in the detail.
Yeah.
You know?
We always talk about specificity.
Something you said a while back, I think when we were doing our Half of It episode, was how you sort of like obsessively, not obsessively, but you watched a lot of teen like coming of age movies because you like were looking for like the answer. This is what I do with the precarious girl genre. I didn't realize until you said that that's what I do with this genre. Like, I watch it because I'm like praying. This is probably like revealing too much about myself, but I'm like praying like I will see a protagonist in something that tells me that what I am feeling as a 20-something-year-old, like what I'm feeling is okay. I'm sorry to say that I have yet to find it, but yeah, and I just think the answer is more. Give more women of color and LGBT people, and give more people the opportunity to make these stories, because I would love to see something that I can go, oh, that's like me. And not in like the way that I've had to extrapolate to the point of like, okay, if I don't think about all this aspect of Fleabag, you know, this and this, she's like, you know, if
What's ironic is that in Fleabag, they actually do kind of express this desire that you've just mentioned, like in the way that, like, not so much like her searching in popular media, but just her, like, wanting someone to just tell her what to do.
I don't want anyone to tell me what to do. I don't relate to that. Like, I just more want someone to tell me, like...
In the way that she's lost in the same way.
I just want someone to tell me that, like, you know, what I'm feeling is okay and normal.
I think both shows do that, but of course there's a limit to what white women are capable of contributing to that genre.
Yeah, that's true.
And you know, there's also a limit to what bisexual Iranian women are capable of expressing as well. I'm worried that this episode is gonna sound that we're talking shit about Fleabag, but I really do love her, not because I feel the show represents my life, because I don't expect that from it. You shouldn't watch Fleabag for the representation. You shouldn't praise Fleabag for the representation. You should just watch it because it's good. You know, actually, same goes for the Bisexual and Michaela Coel's body of work. Like, you should be watching them because they're good. Like, still, not everyone is going to relate to the Bisexual or Chewing Gum, but they're both incredibly funny and smart and interesting shows that are unique takes on the precarious girl. And we should be supporting more diverse stories like them to enrich the genre.
Yes!
Yeah.
My answer to something I would have liked from Fleabag, this comes back to something I teased at the beginning of the episode. I do think that the endgame in Fleabag, like, you know why I don't care that much for the hot priest in Fleabag? Do you want to know why? You know, like, everyone's obsessed with this relationship. I don't care about it. And the reason I don't care is because I believe that the true love of Fleabag's life should have been the sex shop employee, okay? And here is my big argument. Here is my big belief why that is, okay? Fleabag says, like, her main thing, her big monologue is about how, like, sex ruins everything for her, right? Sex, like, you know, she has just, like, ruined her life with sex. Doesn't it make sense that the person who should be the love of her life is someone with a positive view about sex?
Okay.
And can be like, Fleabag, girl... You just need some self-love in, like, more ways than one. And, you know, also won't, like, you know, hide her vibrators and crap. Like, I don't know. I do believe that the love of Fleabag's life is actually that sex shop employee. And I was very upset when I realized that that character never returns.
Okay.
So that's what I wanted from Fleabag. That's why, like, when people are like, season 2 is the greatest thing ever, and Priest and Fleabag relationship goals, like, I'm sorry, I simply do not vibe with you.
Actually, like, one of my favorite things about Phoebe Waller-Bridge is she writes romances like they're horror stories, which is why I am, like, obsessed with Fleabag and the Priest, because, not because, like, you know, I romanticize that, but because it terrifies me so much. Like, I always said, like, I hate romance, but, like, this is like, so interesting. I do need to say, on behalf of a very dear friend, Xavier, that Andrew Scott is hot. I don't know how much I personally think. I really like Andrew Scott. I have stan this man since 2010.
And
okay?
why do you stan this man?
I'm not going to mention.
What did you see?
I'm not going to mention, but I am very glad that... Like, one of the best things that has come out of Fleabag is that Andrew Scott is now being credited as Fleabag's Andrew Scott and not, you know what.
Not that other show. I've also started seeing his Dark Materials, Andrew Scott.
Okay.
But yes, that's our episode, I believe. Haha! Huzzah!
Yeah. If you're interested, Mary will be uploading the paper that she originally wrote comparing Fleabag and the Bisexual onto our Patreon.
Yep, once I edit it a bit.
So, yeah, please consider supporting us for that content and other content.
Send us episode suggestions, sign up for our Patreon, follow us on the socials. Most importantly, biggest thing you can do for us is recommend us to people.
Yes,
Share
please.
us with your crush, with your friends. I don't know, maybe you have, like, a gay nerdy mum. Share it with her. Alright, we love you guys. Stay safe. Keep wearing your masks. And
thank you for listening. And watch The Bisexual by Desiree Akhavan.
Bye.
Bye-bye.